welcome to Dune Chapter by Chapter. I'm Dominic. And so this was quite a large chapter in Dune. It was one of the bigger ones that I've read recently. And so there's lots that happened in this chapter, so there's quite a bit to talk about. So right off the bat, this is the first appearance. We first meet Liet Kynes in this chapter. This is where he shows up with his Fremen guards, but no one really knows he is a Fremen yet. He is, for all intents and purposes, he's still just judges of change, and he is working for the Emperor. And what I like about this, the character of Liet, and also the character of all the Fremen are kind of like this. Like, they're not easily impressed. It doesn't matter how much wealth you have. It doesn't matter what kind of title you have or anything like that. They're not impressed with you. We see this right away in the chapter when Liet first comes out and he's going to go on the tour, see the spice mining with Duke Leto and Paul Atreides. And we see that he doesn't really care for their formal titles like Lord Duke and all that, and he wasn't really impressed that the Mentat through Hawat interrogated him and things like that, and he didn't like the instruction he got from Gurney Halleck to this is the proper way to address the Duke and stuff like that. And then he even slips up quite a bit of times that, and the Duke's not really impressed with that, but he knows that this is a new place that they're in and there are new people that they're trying to gain the loyalty of, so he has to let certain things slide. And so that's what I kind of like about all the Fremen in this in the book of Dune. And but one thing is he is kind of impressed with Paul, and we see this at the beginning of the chapter. He sees how Paul fitted his still suit desert fashion, and he had to show Duke Leto, which is that in itself is something to actually have to talk about. Just that small action, it seems like nothing. So everything in Dune is so, almost every choice when you're in the position that you're in, like Duke Leto, every choice almost has like this life and death impact on it. So he has to make a choice because Liet offers to, show them how to fit their still suits properly, and because the still suits were a gift. And so Duke Leto says, well, if I refuse it, he might be insulted, and that could erode relations, but if I allow him close to me, he could poison me or assassinate me or something like that. So it's like a life and death situation. So he takes the gamble and lets Liet adjust his still suit. And then Liet goes on to see that Paul's already adjusted, and it's just as the prophecy had said, he will know his ways as though born unto them, and things like that. So we see this right away at the start of the chapter. So this kind of gets Liet wondering, but he's still not totally convinced. He doesn't trust the Atreides, because as far as he's concerned, they're just like the Harkonnens, like they're all the same to them. And he's kind of bitter because they just were under Harkonnen rule for so long, and now they're suspect of the Atreides. So the Atreides have to prove themselves, and to the Fremen. And Liet is like the secret leader of the Fremen. And so anyway, then in this chapter, after all that goes on, then they get on the ornithopter and they fly out over the shield wall and to go and inspect the spice mining operations that's going on in the desert nearby. And as they're flying there, we get to learn more about how dangerous Arrakis is. It's like there's just so many descriptions that you just keep learning. Like, it's how horrible of a place it is. It just gets worse, worse, and worse. It's just a place you would never ever want to live on Arrakis. So they ask him, because they mentioned, well, Duke Leto says, well, I want rescue teams now to go out and rescue guys that get caught in the desert. We'll put transmitters on them and all this kind of thing. And then Liet says, well, that's all nice and fine, but none of that's going to work because the dust storms create so much static electricity that it shorts out all radio waves and signals and everything like that. So if that's not going to work. So basically, if you go out to the desert, you're pretty much dead. If you get lost in the desert, there's no walking out of the desert. So then they kind of like ask him, well, what would you do if you were in the desert? And he kind of explains what he would do if he crashed. He would get at least 1,000 meters away from his crashed vehicle if it was out in the open desert, and then he would use his cloak to hide and wait for the worm to come and go. And then he's kind of explaining how you have to walk really softly because you don't want to disturb the sand, because you would get that drum sand going and the vibrations from that would attract a worm again. And the other thing is you have these dust traps where you have these like big sink areas with this really fine dust that has collected there over hundreds and hundreds of years that you can't see it until you walk into it, and then you're done. If you fall down into it, you just suffocate. And then there's these terrible storms that just, cut you to ribbons, things like that. And then there's the biggest danger, the worms themselves, that they just show up, and they're massive, and you basically, if you're caught out in the open desert, there's no escaping them. They're just going to come and swallow you. So there's like so many things on Arrakis that can kill you, which makes the Fremen even that much more impressive, because they're able to just like live there like it's no problem, despite all these dangers. But they know the desert so well. And then we see some eagles and stuff like that. So we learn there's some other things besides the worms living on Arrakis. These other creatures that have adapted to live in this environment that almost has no water. So that's kind of cool. And then Liet Kynes is starting to come around a little more as the chapter goes on with the Atreides, and then he's actually really impressed with the questions that Paul asks, because he's wondering, well, this guy's just a kid, but he's asking these really adult questions and things like that. And the other thing is we see that Paul's training starts to kick in, because they're hammering Liet with a lot of questions in the ornithopter ride to see the mining operations. And Paul kind of detects, he kind of reads the man, he kind of figures him out, and he realizes that he's not being totally truthful with the Atreides. He's only giving them like half-truths and mixed in, like a little bit of truth mixed in with some lies. So he's hiding something. They can detect that he's not giving up all of the secrets. There's something going on there. And then they start to ask them about the relationship between the worms and the spice, because as they're coming up on the mining operation, the spice mining operation, they ask, do worms always show up? And then Liet says, wherever there's spice mining, there's always worms, because they're defending their territory, and their territory can be as big as like 5,000 square kilometers. And then they also talk about shield generators in this one. This is where we learn where Liet tells them, like, you don't ever want to use a shield generator out in the open desert. It'll just, doesn't matter about territory, anything like that. Worms will break each other's territory. They'll all go in a frenzy, and you'll just attract everyone in the area, and you're done. So like shields are completely useless in the desert. It's just a totally useless form of defense. And then they ask him, well, what's the relationship between the spice and the worms? If the worms always defend the spice, why is that? Why do they always defend that? And Liet just kind of vague about it all. Well, they don't really know. There's, we've kind of examined the worms a bit, and then they talk about how hard it is to kill a worm. Like, a worm is almost like indestructible, and really powerful explosives. You might be able to shatter some of the segments, but almost each segment is like an individual worm, almost the way it's kind of described in the book. And they're just so massive, they're almost impossible to kill. And on top of that, it would be extremely expensive to wipe them all out. And but you wouldn't want to do that, because they actually are part of the spice. That's why there's spice on Arrakis, because of the worms. And so then we get to see the spice mining operations, and we get to see what the harvester in action, and it's kind of described as this large beetle-like things that's crawling along the desert with these wide tracks and stuff like that, with almost like a weird nozzle at the end of it, the front of it, that's just sucking up the spice as it goes along, and then the spice is separated from the sand, and then the sand is ejected through the top of the harvester. So we get this weird, yellow cloud over top of it. And as they come up, the harvester then has these spotters that are constantly flying around, these smaller ornithopters that fly around and constantly looking for worm sign. So they have to be always looking for worm sign, because a worm always inevitably shows up. So again, it just goes to show how dangerous Arrakis is with even spice mining, because that's just going to draw the worms right to it. So we get a little bit more, and that's probably about the most description Frank Herbert goes into about the spiced harvester. It's just basically like a big beetle with tires on it. That's all. He doesn't really go into much more than that. So that's kind of what it looked like in the David Lynch movie. So, and they had a different kind of looking harvester in the miniseries, but I'm really curious now that I'm reading the book and all these things are mentioned, what they're going to look like in the new Denis Villeneuve movie. that's coming out hopefully in December. What the spice harvesters, what is their spin or their take on that spice harvester, that mobile factory on the sand? What is that going to look like in the upcoming film? Because there's a lot of, the way it's described is pretty vague in the book, so there's a lot of room for interpretation. But what we can see, I'm kind of suspecting it might be bug-like, because we saw some pictures of the ornithopters kind of have that bug-like theme to it, with the wings, and they're almost kind of look like the landing gears kind of look like insect legs. So I think they might go with the same kind of look for the harvester as well. So they show up at the harvester, and they're explaining the mining process, and there's like 26 men on this on the spice harvester. That's the crew on the that work on the harvester. That's the crew complement. So then it's actually Duke Leto himself that spots the worm sign. They see like a worm, and it's kind of described how like a large fish cuts through the water when it's just below the surface. The worm does the same thing. So you don't see the worm, you just see the ripples in the sand of it approaching. So they actually spot the worm, Duke Leto, and then so they alert the harvester. And this is where things start to go awry for them, because there's supposed to be a carryall nearby that will actually come down at the last minute. They'll keep going to the very last minute, grab that harvester and take it up before the worm gets it. So something happened to the carryall, something happens to it. They don't know, spotters don't know, it's gone. So now they're all in a panic. They don't know what to do. So then they have to do the math. Okay, well, there's so many men can fit on each one of these. 2 guys can fit on each one of these spotters. Plus there's the Duke's own ornithopter. Plus there's the ornithopters that came along as like an escort to the Duke, that's also in the air, and they can hold so many men. So they have to leave 3 guys behind, because they only got so much room. So the Duke tells them, well, we can take these many guys, 3 guys have to stay behind, so figure it out however you want. So that kind of seems cruel, that 3 guys got to be left behind. But then as the chapter goes on throughout the story there, the Duke realizes that, well, if we tear out a seat here or throw a shield generator there, we can fit an extra couple guys in there. We can get everyone on board. I'm not going to leave anyone to the fate of being swallowed by the worm. And then that's where Liet starts to turn around his mind on Duke Leto, because he's so used to the Harkonnens. The Harkonnens wouldn't have cared. They would have saved all the spice and let all the men die. Where Duke Leto, his concern is more with the lives of the men and not the spice. So they get all the men on board, and they take off. And then this is where we get to see the first glimpse. Like if this was a movie, this would be the first glimpse of a sandworm, is when this thing comes through the sand, and they see first, it's described in the book as the sand starts to, almost like a vortex of sand, a whirlpool of sand forms. And the carryall is sinking into it. And then you just see this huge maw come up with all these sparkling white spokes of teeth that come up, and then it's twice the size in length as the spice harvester itself. Then the spice harvester just basically gets swallowed up by it, and it goes back down into the desert. So we get to see some of the worm here, and I'm curious how this is going to look in the film when the film comes out. This scene, because this is was done in the David Lynch movie, and it was done on the 2000 miniseries. Now, in the David Lynch movie, you just saw basically the mouth come up and swallow it down, but you didn't get to see the whole worm. But in the 2000 miniseries, this is where you really get to see the worm. Like the full worm comes out and swallows that harvester, and it almost sucks down, in the miniseries, it almost sucks their ornithopter down inside of it too. But that's the first they show it, like the whole thing. So recently it was revealed in one of the interviews that you'll only catch glimpses of the worms. So this is probably how it's going to work in the movie, and I'm just trying to envision it in my head with modern day special effects, how cool the scene is going to be and how it's described in the book and stuff. So then anyway, they're just like, Liet tells them, like, you're going to see something that, barely anyone ever see. And that's a worm swallowing a whole spice harvester. So they witness, and they're all pretty impressed, as you would be with a creature like that. And then Paul starts to suspect that, well, maybe some of the guys on this crew are Fremen. And then as they're leaving, they see 2 guys. After the worm has left, they see 2 men running across the desert. And 2 guys were left behind. And the Duke is frustrated and infuriated because he wanted no one left behind. He wanted nobody left behind. He wanted everyone on board. And then he says, well, I'm going to send someone back to rescue those 2 guys. And Liet just says, there's no point. They're going to be dead. Like, you're never going to rescue these guys. And when you come out in the desert like that, you're done. And then Paul kind of clues in that, again, Liet is not being truthful. Liet doesn't, Liet's not concerned about the danger of these men, because Liet knows these men are in no danger because they're Fremen. They know exactly how to live. And they're not going to be there when they send the rescue ship, because they're going to be disappeared out into the desert, because the Fremen know how to live on Arrakis. And then Paul picks up on that, and he starts to realize, like, yeah, this is how the Fremen are. Like, these guys are Fremen. And Liet knows that, and he's kind of keeping it to himself, and there's probably other Fremen on board this crew. And so that was a cool thing. And then at the closing of the chapter, we have Liet Kynes does like turns around this whole. He almost goes through like a miniature character arc in this chapter, because at the beginning of the chapter, he doesn't really respect the Atreides. He thinks they're the same as the Harkonnens. He's not impressed by them at all. And at the beginning, he's even mentioned that he was ordered to betray them. I'm not exactly sure by who. Maybe the Harkonnens, or probably the Emperor, since he is direct employee of the Emperor. And but now he's having doubts. Besides his judgment, he says, his better judgment, he likes this new Duke, and he was really impressed that the Duke was more concerned about the spice than, the Duke was more concerned about the men than the spice, and just let the vehicle get the whole spice load. That was quite a bit, was a fortune in spice, just get devoured by the worm, just so they can save the men, because something happened to the carryall. Probably has something to do with Harkonnens. He's done a 180. He realized, well, maybe these Atreides, there's more to these guys. They're not just, these soft outworlders. There's more to them. They seem to have a strength, and they seem to be very loyal. And then he realizes, like, a man this loyal that would dump all that treasure for his men's lives, he would have a fanatical following. The people that would be loyal to him would be fanatical to him. And then he realizes, like, someone like this would be very difficult to defeat because of the loyalty that his men would have for him. So that was like a cool ending to the chapter. There was so much in this chapter. It was a big chapter, and all these little intrigues between the Fremen and Liet and all this stuff. And then we getting to see the worm. And this is a scene that for sure, this is like one of the key scenes, the arrival of Liet and the first appearance of a worm and all of that. It's gonna be amazing to see it on screen when the film drops in December. It's gonna be really cool. So that's everything I got to say in this video. Let me know what you think in the comments section, and I will see you at the next one.